University. In addition to that, a professor emerita at Dalhousie University here in Canada, as well as research professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, who happens to be one of the leading theorists in gender and IR. And today she will be speaking about her new book,
Yes.
Rethinking.
Just arrived.
Just arrived, freshly
like a
here.
week ago.
It's the start of a book tour, shall we say. Rethinking Silence, Voice and Agency in Contested Gender Terrains. Do you mind if I pass it around so that people can take a look?
I'd be delighted to have people
Yes.
take a look at it.
And so the format, for those of you who are here for the first time, usually the speaker gets 30 to 40 minutes to present the argument, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. We have until about 1:20. Yes?
Just a question, but I wonder, is that shade able to come down?
Oh, yes, absolutely. We'll
yeah.
figure it out. I guess we can.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Look at this
I'll just give the floor
interesting
to.
design.
Yeah, this is an interesting design, very, very Nordic.
Yes.
The floor is yours. Please join me in thanking.
Well, thank you for coming, and I just thought I'd first just give a little tiny bit of background to how I got into this project, because I was invited in 2008 to write an article on silence in development, and I had for quite a while been a little bit concerned about the classic definition that Naila Kabir had created, and we had all followed, saying that basically that to have agency, a person, including women, had to be able to speak out and act. That, in other words, voice became a very important part of the definition of being an active agent as a woman around the world. And there was a little piece of me that disagreed with that. I had a feeling, I was thinking of especially cases in Africa where I've done most of my research, where there are many times when people can't speak out. In fact, the only action you can take to protect yourself often is silence. So I wrote a little piece called Choosing Silence and presented it, and then University of Michigan State University has a gender series, and they asked me to put it in their gender series, which is working papers. This is after it had been published in a book. And they invited Naila Kabir to comment on mine, which was a little unnerving, because I had criticized her in the article, and so she was critical, and then I had to do a little rejoinder. And so this all, and so then I sort of was put in the position of defending my feeling that we had to think about not just voice, but silence as something that could be a strategic tool for protection, for all kinds of things. But at that point, I was really situating myself within the development literature and the gender literature, but I hadn't really thought about the degree to which there's the literature on silence exists. And then I began to ask questions about silence, and eventually came up with this idea for a book on rethinking silence, voice, and agency, particularly in contested gender terrains, looking particularly at the way women deal with dangerous situations. And then let's see, how do I just go like that?
So this one, yeah.
That one, okay, there. So then I began to realize that the silence literature is actually much deeper and more complicated, and also exists largely, I didn't know if you realize this, but the silence literature, the issue of silence is largely taken up by scholars in communications departments. Also, it is in a lot of the some philosophy courses, religion, some gender courses. There's some good literature on gender and silence. And so I, for the last year and a half, I have basically been reading the libraries on silence and using the U of O and the Carleton libraries particularly to read, and realizing that I have to read very widely. So that has been, actually a tremendous exploration and very exciting, and it has given me a chance to bring a more sophisticated and complicated notion of silence to the question of dangerous and gendered arenas. So the backdrop of all of this is that we do have to remember that early feminists, thinking particularly about feminists in the West, at that point, early feminism was trying to gain a voice. I mean, what was happening in the 1800s? Women were beginning to speak out. It was really the 1880s, the Grimke sisters. Have any of you ever heard this story about the Grimke sisters in Boston? Gave a public talk on slavery. They were strong anti-slavery abolitionists. And the next day, the newspaper in Boston had a front page article and picture. A woman speaks in public. Unheard of, unbelievable, a terrible idea that may catch on is dangerous. That in the 1880s in the US, there was, even though women had been very active in the abolition movement, in the anti-slavery, women still were not seen as they were not supposed to speak in public. Maybe occasionally in family gatherings, but not to give speeches. And in fact, a famous orator in Boston challenged one of the Grimke sisters, Angelina, to a duel, a debate, public debate. And she made mincemeat out of him. And that probably made the whole thing even more unpopular. But so it's important that when the feminist movement started to come up again in the 60s, and I was part of this, I'm very proud to be part of it, we never thought about silence as being anything other than something that was forced on us. We were seeking voice. Voice was seen as resistance. It was seen as powerful. So the women's movement has been embedded, particularly in the North, in the global North. But actually, I'm going to go on to the next slide. I forgot. This introduction is just to say that I'm looking at the early feminists, the post-colonial debates that bring in new ideas and important things we have to understand, and the need that we cannot just look at silence and voice. We have to look at institutions as well. So, sorry. Here, this is what I'm talking about, the historic struggles. So, I think it's important to remember that the feminist movement in the global North has had a very great preoccupation with women gaining the right to stand up here, like I'm doing now, and not be on the front page of the Ottawa Citizen saying that an unruly woman is out of place. So we have to remember that in the 60s, it was still a struggle to get women to feel comfortable and to be accepted in public arenas. And so that provides a backdrop which I think is important in why so much of the women's movement has privileged voice over silence, because so much silence has been seen as something that's been put onto people. Women have been silenced through the history, so getting voice has been very important. So as a result, most of the literature coming out, even literature written by me as well, has been really about women gaining voice and how that was empowering. That was, I wrote a whole book on women and empowerment that never questioned the idea of voice as the quintessential proof that one had gained agency and power and significance, and it was crucial. And I'm not saying it wasn't crucial. All I'm saying is that we perhaps have then, as a result, felt that silence was always a negative. Silence was what you didn't want to be forced to do. And choosing silence was always seen as questionable if you wanted to be an enlightened, empowered, New Age woman. Now, in terms of the gender and development literature in the North, took that attitude, took the kind of global North perspective on voice and agency and gender into and assumed the same goals for women all over the world. They were drawing on their own experiences of being silenced and assuming that every society in the world sees silence always as a negative. And even the solutions for gender were seen as sites where you were not able to actually make any difference if you didn't speak up. And then one of the problems that I think is important to remember is that in the global North, despite the gender and development literature focusing technically on women and men, the emphasis has been on women. It's been on women as peacemakers. The girl effect, if any of you, hopefully some of you have heard about this idea, the girl effect, which became very, very big in the last 10 years, about the idea that you take a little girl full of energy, you give her a cow, then she gets, the cow grows, and then then there's another cow, a baby cow, and then she has 2 cows, and then she has 6 cows, and then she becomes important, and so then the men ask her to come to meetings, then they listen to her, and then her status then changes the status of all the women in the village. And this became a big thing that DFID especially has made, and it allowed not only to romanticize the capability of women, of girls and women in the global South to speak out, it also allowed for not engaging with men and gendered power relations with all of their problems. So that it's very important to realize that a lot of the development literature in the North has actually focused more on empowering women to speak and has done very little to talk about the actual gender relations in society that mean that even if you speak, you may not be heard or you may not make any difference. And then I have, like many of us, been affected by the shift to feminist post-colonial literature, particularly the work of Anna Agathangelo and Lily Ling on Transforming World Politics, which is a transformative book that came out about 2010 or so, 2011, which really holds the global North puts the feet to the fire and says basically, you can't read us. You can't define the whole world and all the different cultures and all the different ways that people live through your lens of a global North lens and assumptions. And so you have to, they argue that basically you cannot do political economy, you cannot do IPE, you cannot do any kind of global analysis without paying attention to the varieties of global feminisms, of gendered cultural and economic and political practices. They're calling for basically the global south to start speaking back to and to be taken seriously as a force for developing a more truly global understanding of the world. And this relates to analysis of gender and feminism, as well as to political economy and all kinds of other things. So the focus, they argue that the focus has to be on the politics of gender equality in particular life worlds. And just to give you an idea, for instance, the Ubuntu movement. Some scholars have pointed out that the Ubuntu movement in Africa has argued that women's liberation in Africa cannot occur if women see men always as the enemy. That you have to have an understanding of African notions of gender equality, and that you have to understand gender in local context, not just plunk onto them some model from the north about what we think is the best way to be. The pietist movement in Zimbabwe demonstrates that women in the pietist movements during the liberation struggle and afterwards, particularly in the violent early independence struggles in parts in the Bulawayo region of Zimbabwe, that many of the women in that church used silence as a form of power. They chose when to speak and they chose when not to speak. And that ability to know how to use speech began to be recognized as another form of power, rather than thinking, are they able to speak? China, there's examples in China of the way in which women negotiate family politics through choice of words and choosing when to speak and when not to speak, and that is a very important strategy. It is taught to people in their childhood, and they learn to use it. And then I don't know if any of you know, this is old work, but it's wonderful, very in-depth study of the Western Apache people in North America. And I'm blanking on the name of the author. It begins with a B. Sorry. But he did this anthropologist lived with the Apache people for many years and got to know them inside and out. And actually, in my first job was in Colorado, and there was a joke going around that a Navajo family included a father, grandmother, grandfather, mother, father, 3 children, and an anthropologist. There were so many anthropologists. Basso, that's his name, Keith Basso. He discovered that there was, in fact, within the Apache culture, 6 different actions that were part of regular social life that required silence. That silence was worked into the culture in many different ways. And that if you didn't do that, then you got yourself into very deep trouble. So that I think that we have to, all of this helps me to understand that that you can't you have to think about silence as a social action and embedded in different social and economic and cultural and political institutions. That you have to look at silence in this much more complex vision, rather than seeing it as just the opposite of voice, and therefore really like a 0 rather than a number. And so I think that it's very important that we take this and start rethinking silence, voice, and agency in a post-colonial world, which is where we all live in this post-colonial world. You know, we're post-colonial here in Canada. And I think it's this is where I get down to the kind of the guts of the book, which is basically that while, as I've said, while silence can be seen as disempowerment, it can also be very powerful. Now, I wanted to try to look at how silence can be powerful in these often dangerous situations that we were looking at. And at the most basic level, I think it's important to realize that silence can be a coping mechanism. I have a few little quotes to read here. That basically, at the most basic level, and we've all seen this, certainly all of us at some point or other have felt that we're in a situation where if we speak anymore, it's going to get worse. I'm sure most of us have had that experience, and the experience that, okay, this is time to withdraw and be silent. You know, so that silence can be an action that is, it can be a choice. It can be something you do to cope with the situation. So that it may not solve the situation in the long term, but it is a very important way of handling what can be a dangerous situation or a serious conflict. And so that is sort of the basic level at which I see silence operating. But then I think it's with my readings on silence, I began to realize that silence can't just be seen as coping with a dangerous situation, like if a woman's in a house and her husband threatens her and she just doesn't say anything. We all understand something like that. That's a very basic use of silence. What about thinking about silence as something more complicated and more powerful than that? And I think that is where I started to realize, as I'm reading all over, I began to see that silence it can actually enable reflection, it can provide a place for healing, it can allow you to rethink your position. And I have a quote here from Elena Stone. It says, "There is a silence in which you have no voice, but there is also a silence in which you have chosen not to express your voice. That's a nice place. It's a place of freedom, ultimate and total freedom, so much that it is a much more spacious voice." And then Max Picard, who's a philosopher, 1888 to 1965, who wrote extensively on silence. He said he regarded silence as spiritual rather than material, arguing that there is more help and healing in silence than in all the useful things. The Buddhists have long used silent meditation as a path of reflection and peace, but also as a major form of dealing with life and also with heightening one's sensitivity, awareness, one's ability to see the complexities of life. The more you sometimes you can talk, and you see nothing. I think so I began to see that silence could be a really powerful, transformative place, a site providing precious time and solitude for gathering one's thoughts, thinking in new ways, and developing inner strength. And I think that is another very important level. But then I discovered another level, and particularly relevant for those of us thinking about secure and insecure, about insecure sites, particularly insecure sites. And that is the idea that silence can actually also be a platform, not just for healing oneself, it can also be a platform for beginning to think differently about where am I? How can I cope? How can I change things? How can I make a difference? How can I even really organize resistance? How can I bring about real fundamental healing? And that's where I began to realize that there's a fantastically interesting literature on this about, like Adrienne Rich points out, silence can be a plan rigorously executed. Do not confuse it with any kind of absence. So interesting. And Glenn has written saying, silence can be a specifically feminist rhetorical act, often one of resistance. And they use Anita Hill's case as a case where she chose to be silent about the bad behavior, sexual advances of Clarence Thomas. And when he was going up to be a judge on the Supreme Court, just like our Kavanaugh debacle, she spoke out and told her story. And as in the current situation, he still got on the Supreme Court. But at least she did speak out. But she chose when not to and when to. So it's this idea that it's a kind of silence has all these different layers and levels and possibilities. And I think that's what's really important for us to think about. That rather than think of it as the absence of voice and putting everything that's action-oriented onto voice, you now have silence also as a potential site for empowerment, for rethinking, for strategizing, and for outright resistance. It's also important to think about, this is moving on to the notion of collective silence. It's also important to think about the way in which can silence be powerful. Have any of you heard of the Women in Black? How am I doing on time? I'll try to wrap up as soon as possible. The Women in Black movement. I happened to be in London once when they were a whole bunch of women from the Women in Black movement, and included men as well as women, stood in Trafalgar Square, completely silent, next to each other, body to body. And it was, I just happened upon it and thought, well, I'll try this. It was an astonishing experience. It was like, well, it's best said by one of the authors, Cynthia Cockburn, who writes, she says, there is something calming about vigiling, holding yourself in silence and stillness as city workers and tourists mill around you, and the taxis and buses stream past. What restores me as I stand there, once again, is the presence of other women at my shoulder, the carefully thought out message we are trying to put across, and more than anything, the feeling that women are doing this in hundreds of similar vigils around the world. The power of collective silence is also something we need to take very seriously. Think about the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina. They stood silently around a square once a week with diapers on their heads, and they helped to bring down a government. I think this is a very important example of the power of silence, particularly the collective power. But I think it's also very important to look at the way silence and voice are often intertwined, and that sometimes it's very important to decide when to speak and when to not speak, and that so often in many situations that if you want to use words and silences to deal with patriarchal power, this can be another very important strategy, so that we don't think always, we tend to think we have to stand up and make a case, we have to speak or we have to write, but standing up and silently saying nothing actually holds great power. And I think that's both alone and both in group situations. So I think that is very important. Finally here, the silence in voice. This is a very, very interesting. This is one of the contributions to the book is by two young women who've studied Israeli women in the military. And what they discovered was that when they were interviewing these young women about their lives and their experiences of conflict, that the women, when they were comfortable with what they were saying, would use the word I. I did this, I saw that. And then they realized, they noticed that they would shift sometimes when they started talking about things that were more uncomfortable topics, that talked about some of the misbehavior of some of the troops, male and female. They would shift from I to you. And these two young scholars, drawing on some of the work on listening done by Gilchrist, an early feminist, they started to use some of the tools for thinking about silences behind words. What does it mean when someone shifts from I to you? What's going on behind the word that you don't know? And what they realized is that when these young women were talking about using you, when they shifted to you, they were moving into territory where they were talking about behavior that actually was that was very dubious and negative and harmful, and that they didn't want to attach themselves to it. So and that it was really a lot about the behavior of the men who were raping a lot of the women, the Palestinian women that they were doing, and just general bad behavior. So that what is interesting is they said that, you know, we have to not only look for silences that you can see. You can have people talking, and behind the talk, there are silences. I think this is a very, very important approach to analyzing, because we're all scholars, we've all interviewed people. But there are times when you're talking with someone and you can feel it's getting uncomfortable and the language shifts. Has anyone experienced that in talking, in an interview or just even talking with someone, and suddenly they start moving into something where it's clear that there's something going on that they only want to tell part of. So this is another kind of technique that I think is very, very important for understanding what the silences behind voice are saying. And this is something that I think needs to be taken seriously. So in conclusion, really what I'd like to say is that I think gendered power is not solely linked to voice. We need to understand that voice still has power. Silence also has a great deal of power, and it's a power we often tend to ignore. And as feminists who've been so concerned to make sure that we can speak, and we can speak publicly, and we can make a difference. And here I am up here waving my arms and speaking. And that feels good. But I think that it's important to remember that when people choose silence, they're also speaking. And sometimes they're speaking in ways that is very, very significant. And you have to find other ways to understand what meanings are there. And the silence is more complex, more powerful, and more communicative than we have assumed. It needs to be understood as something that we as scholars take seriously, that we read some of the literature that gives us a sense to understand. I mean, like all the people dealing with security and insecurity need to read the literature that talks about silence in insecure sites, because that literature has many things to say to people about how to understand what you can and can't hear, what people say and don't say, what people do and don't do. And I think that's crucial. And post-colonial perspectives, I think, add a much needed complexity and nuance to this analysis. And they have played a key role in pushing us to move towards a more complicated notion of silence and voice. And we need to, and also the importance of understanding not just writing grand tomes on global governance and big forces and the UN and the government and everything, but remembering that there is knowledge that exists that helps you explain how the world is understood and acted upon at all levels. And you have to understand that the silences of an old man in a village in Africa may tell you more if you actually engage with them than if you went to a lecture by a famous professor telling you what he knows about the old man in a village in Africa. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Let's open it up for some questions.
Have I silenced him?
Yeah. Please.
Thanks, Jane. That was great. I'm completely convinced by the theory, but I'm a geographer and I like real-world examples, I suppose. I found those tantalizing. I guess I need to buy the book and read the book.
Yes,
But
please,
also-
everyone buy the book.
Being a geographer, to me what would enrich all of this is like the where question, because it's not just choosing to be silent and when, but also choosing to be silent where. So there are like public silences. I was thinking of the black sash in South Africa, right? The anti-apartheid black sash, where women would wear black sash and would stand in a prominent public place without saying anything or yelling or clapping, which is similar to the women in black that you were describing. But I mean, are those where questions explored in the book?
Yes, I think there are.
Geographers on this stuff, would maybe emphasize that.
I don't have anyone in the book who's actually a geographer that I know of, but I do think that everyone writing in the book is aware of the nuances of the way voice and silence is. They're not like two separate things. Like you go up to a podium and you lecture, and then you go home and you're silent, you know. So much of, and because we also have to think about the notion of performativity, about how people speak. It's not just some people speak one way, some people speak other ways, some people. So both silence and speech are used, I think, in very complicated contextual ways, and we have to understand the cultural context, we have to understand the historical context, then we have to also talk to some people and hang out and see what's going on. I mean, all the kind of, I just think that this adds an important tool to our thinking when we go into a situation and we're trying to analyze it. That we're usually trying to look for what people are doing and saying. If we can start also asking the question, what are they not saying? Or how does not saying and saying work together? Where are the silences behind what is said? Which is why I think this is so powerful, this work on the Israeli military. It's very, very, very powerful to me in terms of suggesting ways of approaching, analyzing situations, particularly situations that can be insecure.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see.
Okay, oh sure, thank you. I'm wondering if anxiety came up as a topic in this and kind of the gender differences in anxiety and be it internal anxiety of the fear of
See if
speaking
I can get
up
at the
or,
front so I can see everything.
oh sure, be it internal anxieties of the fear of speaking up or having a voice
Mhm.
or maybe more external anxieties like fears about climate change or things going on in the world.
Well, you mean, you see those as things that silence people?
Perhaps, but maybe they could also be indicators that the way that we're setting up the world where we favor excellent public speakers or people who can deliver content really well, maybe that's a situation where those silences can be a symbol of a problem that's going on.
No, I mean, this is a very deep question. I think what I'm not hearing in you, and one of my own story, is that my mother is a Quaker. And her family have been Quakers for 12 generations in Rhode Island. And so I grew up going to these, to Quaker meetings where you just sit and don't say anything unless you feel moved to say something. But otherwise, everyone sits quietly. You know, they don't, and it's interesting, when I first went, I thought, oh, I probably have to say something. It felt like it's in school, you know, you have to perform. But actually, what's interesting is that there's a kind of atmosphere in many of the times I've gone to friends' meeting, of an atmosphere that suggests that quiet should be comfortable, that quiet is normal, that you shouldn't speak, you shouldn't feel you must speak, you should only speak if you feel that there's something that you want to say. And that, you know, I've always found that very interesting. I think a lot of us wind up feeling, I know if I get really nervous, sometimes I just start talking out of like anxiety. You feel like you have to say something. And one of the things I think that when you look at like Buddhism, Taoism, a lot of the meditative religions, the idea, the whole focus is on gaining a sense of self that does not require talk. You talk when you feel that talking is the right thing to do, but you don't have this like, I've got to say something, because isn't everyone really nervous because no one's saying anything? And so that's where, I mean, and because we don't, most of us spend much time doing, I mean, I know I'm taking yoga now. I've started taking yoga. Is anyone here doing yoga? I find it's very soothing. It gives you a kind of, and you leave there, I leave after an hour feeling sort of calmer and stretched, which is good. But, so I think that it is interesting. I took a course on Sufism years ago when I was a PhD student at Boston University in the African Studies program. And I remember going in and like an idiot, I said, well, what is Sufism? Everyone's like, why is she here? I don't even know what it is. I guess it was like a course, it looked interesting. I thought, well, whatever. But it introduced us to the writings of some of the great Sufi thinkers. And you know what was interesting to me is that some of these writings, I still have all the books I have from there. I'll never throw them away. I don't necessarily read them, but I have to have them with me. And the Sufi analysis is based on gaining a sense of self-knowledge and self-discipline. And that the way they say it is they basically say that through this meditation, you reach a level of understanding about the world that you cannot have in everyday life. That in fact, there's a system of this self-training in philosophical. It involves years of work, but it's incredibly powerful, and it provides people with an ability to see the world. And I'm sure if I went back to this literature with a silence lens, maybe that's why I somehow felt that this was an important way to go. But there is the literature on Sufism is really, it winds up claiming that if you follow this path, you can gain a sense of self-awareness and peace and inner peace. You can see the world. Basically what they argued is that most of us know about the world, we learn about it, and we take exams, we spill it out on papers. But that there are levels of consciousness that are require work to get to, discipline, that you have to work with a master who has already gotten there. And eventually, with years of discipline, you too can begin to see the world from a different perspective than most people do. And, you know, I mean, one of the stories that's always fascinated me in Senegal, in the colonial period, there was a Sufi leader who also was raising cotton and things and stuff, and people were pouring in to live with him and work with him. And the French decided that he was a menace, and so they arrested him, and they took him deep into the desert, deep into the Sahara, to a place where it was just absolutely almost uninhabitable. And they left him there with a few people. Within a year, there were 100,000 followers who had gone into the desert to be with him, because they wanted to learn from him and they wanted to take on the Sufi way. And the French couldn't understand. They're saying, well, why are they doing that? It makes no sense. Why are they going into the desert? So I guess what I'm saying is, if you read some of this literature, which I haven't gone back to for a long time, it really influenced my life in the 70s when I needed to sort out a lot of really heavy-duty stuff. And it really made me feel like there were different levels of consciousness, and that silence and the use of silence is in fact one of the key mechanisms for gaining a greater, a more universal, a different kind of philosophical position and understanding about humanity, about life, about the world. And I think that's stuck with me, and I think we don't have enough of that. There are loads of people doing yoga and that's good, that's great, you know. But I do think that there is a whole deep literature that is very global. It comes from all around the world. It goes far, far back into human experience. And the people that connect to that literature in any way, to that tradition, obviously find that it makes a huge difference in how they view the world, deal with the world, and deal with voice as well as silence. And silence being at the core of a lot of this philosophical approach to the world, which has influenced millions of people over centuries and centuries.
This isn't really a question, more if you could just expand on it, but just thinking about silence, how it can be sort of a transition phase. So thinking kind of like when someone talks and talks and talks, and sometimes we feel like we say the same thing in a different way over and over again, and how there comes a point where you just need to like stop talking and start reflecting on yourself, which is really interesting. And sometimes silence can be like an understanding between two people that you've said everything there is to say, or maybe that there aren't really words for to say anymore. Just like thinking about even like if someone is going through pain or sorrow or happiness, sometimes there's not really words. You just be silent with them, and it's really interesting transition phase between words and actions.
I think that's a wonderful, wonderful comment. I'm sure everyone in the room has felt that at times, that there are times when we know that silence is better than, that there's no words that can help as much as silent communal working together in silence, as well as silent reflection alone. That's great. Yeah, Ava?
It's interesting, you know, what you're saying, and certainly gives food for thought. But it sort of implies a kind of level of suffering, you know. If you're talking about social change, if you're talking about improving things for women, And I would argue that we're at a particular moment in human history right now that there's less silence than ever before. You know, with social media, there's more of a voice, you know, for anyone who wants to access it, talking about a certain level of education and, you know, some level of economic capacity. But that's fairly widespread around the world. And the kinds of things you're saying sort of, I mean, there's a reason why we have the expression suffer in silence. And,
The expression what?
suffer in silence.
Suffering in silence, yes.
And there's kind of an implication that people will be impacted, you know, by the silence of the women standing in the square. Weren't they using pots and pans, as I recall? But or will be, you know, influenced by someone who you know, is nobly just not responding to the insults of a Donald Trump. I mean, our better nature tells us that that's what we would like to see. But the reality of the world is that, you know, most people now are slinging back mud, you know, as soon as they receive it, and sometimes even before. You know, so there's a kind of contradiction there.
Well, I think
to hear
you're right. You're right that there's more communication than ever. I find, you know, with having my cell phone, I sit on a bus, I almost never sit there quietly just observing and things. I get out my cell phone and read the New York Times and carry on, you know, yelling at my phone. I just think we may, in fact, it's interesting because I think we may be reaching at a point where there's so much talk that it's almost too much talk. I think we need both. I think voice is very important. I would never want to say that any group that has been feeling like it is kept from speaking, that is a bad thing. People should have the freedom to speak when they want, where they want, as long as they're not doing something really vicious and awful and horrible. But I do think that understanding that silent reflection, that silence has also much restorative power. It even has communicative power. It can be, it can strengthen people and help them so that when they do speak, they know why they're speaking, and they know what they understand why they've chosen to speak, rather than just feeling that you should just say something to break the silence. That's my own feeling. I feel we need both, but I feel like in the global north we have moved away, many of us have moved away from thinking about the power of silence, and we have become obsessed with being able to speak and speak out. And as a professor, of course, I spend my life speaking, but I think that it's very important to think about silent reflection also. And silence, I'm fascinated by this notion of collective silence as well as a form of I went to an ashram in India once, and there, you know, in India, silence, collective silence is seen as something that everyone must do, and it's seen as a life skill. And if you don't do it, you're seen as not gaining the kind of knowledge of how to deal with life that you need in order to survive and flourish. And so I think we have a lot to learn from the cultures around the world throughout time that have not only raised the importance of voice, but have also spoken about the power and importance of silence. And I think that's enough. Unless there's a burning question.
I have one question. I have a comment and a question. First of all, thank you. I thought that was really, really very, very interesting. I'm a big believer in silence. I wish there was more of it. I grew up with a dad, just as a small story. We used to have an old Norwegian word that has completely disappeared, which referred to the period of the day when it was too dark to do anything, like read or repair socks or anything, but too early, still too light to light the lamps. And there was a special word for this period of the day where you just sat and did nothing. And we always, with my dad, I always used to sit and do nothing. And we normally didn't speak. And I think so. I'm a great believer in silence for personal reflection, personal strength, introspection, sometimes to suffer in silence, but sometimes to look at your position when you suffer and how you can overcome it. So what you were saying, Jane, about, you know, a way of reflecting, of strategizing, of what am I going to do?
Right.
But when I listen to you and when I look at your concluding slide here, what I was most of all struck by is also, I think when silence is powerful, as you say there, it's a performance. So the relationship between silence and performance. And that performance, I think, has to be public to be powerful and to be kind of gendered resistance. So all your examples of powerful silence that have contributed to changing things were very public displays of silence. And I'm wondering, so it would be interesting to say more about the relationship between silence and performance, and also I was thinking of speech act theory, where one always talks about there needs to be an audience for the speech act. There also needs to be an audience for the silence to have broader social and political effect. And it would be interesting in your case studies in your book, you know, what's the role of the audience in this performance of silence?
I was thinking I have one more slide which gives the chapters of the book. And in fact, Christine Sylvester talks about silence and the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, and she's sounding like you. She says silence is part of this experience with this powerful monument, but it also, to her, has limits. And then Lynne Hansen has an amazing chapter using graphic novels, and in the book there are we got 6 pictures out of the graphic novel into the book where she explains the role of silence in in creating one of the 3 narratives of explaining a particular situation and the power of that. And then Bergeron and Marchand are talking about the kind of silences that women use in households to protect their economic interests. And so those are often rarely done, sometimes done alone, sometimes done with others. And Dury Smith, then there's Dury Smith is more abstract, and then the Halal Shavat and Daphne Tekoa, that's the Israeli piece. Then Katherine Alley she's one of my PhD students from Trinidad, and where I taught for 4 years, and she has worked on the Bail Boys. These are young men who have been criminals whose lives have been completely destructive and wound up with them in jail and on their way and they were given an opportunity to to be part of a kind of a group therapy with a lawyer judge who managed to make this happen. And almost all of them, there were a few that didn't manage to move forward, but almost all of them using meditation and a variety of different kinds of strategies that included voice speaking, but also quietly rethinking their own lives and taking ownership of the negative things that they have done to all the people around them, and coming to grips with their own sins and beginning to reach a point of determination to do something about it. It's a very powerful piece. And then Susan Thompson writing about the Rwandan Genocide and the way silence enables people who are genocide survivors to survive in current Rwanda, which is very powerful again. And then Silence in Indigenous Women's Resistance is a piece with Swati Parashar, my co-editor, and an anthropologist from India about a tribal group I don't like, that's how they label themselves, a group of people who have a cultural practice that once every 12 years the women rise up and misbehave in ways they assert their dominance over the men. And so very interesting. It's become a tradition, and the men are just know that they can't get in the way or they'll be mowed down. And then the last one is Sudeshna Chatterjee and myself on, she's looking at sexual commerce industry, and there silence, when you speak and when you don't speak, is a matter often of survival, but it's also a matter that reflects, you know, whether you're in a safe spot or not, whether you're in a spot where you can speak or whether you're in a spot where you cannot speak. So all of these bring different kind of cases to bear, and it's fascinating to hear your story about, I don't know, I think, yes, I found the Nordic love of silence and of candles. I love that, I love it. But I think sometimes that silence is solitary and sometimes it's communal. And I think solitary silence may have a different kind of impact than communal. Like the Quakers when they're together, that's the bonding of the group is very important. But there are also times when you, I think all of us have had a moment when we felt we had to be alone. We had to be alone with ourselves, our own devils, our own fears, and I think that's very important. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I really enjoyed the chance to deal with such interesting questions. This book has made a huge impact on myself, and you can imagine, and I'm very, very, very proud of it and delighted that it's out, and I hope it will interest people around the world. And it can be bought at Routledge on a soft copy, which is much cheaper than getting the hard copies. I hope it'll get enough interest. Silence is starting to come up. I'm finding articles and books about it coming up around the world. And so maybe this is the beginning of something that
I have one
is important. Yeah?
I think there's a lot of stereotypes, and I've always looked at it too in terms of the cognitive, like it's hard, you can't just say something and change somebody's mind. So, and even sometimes if you repeat it over and over and over, it will change somebody's mind. So there has to be, so basically it's worth it to say something, but at one point, maybe you say it once just to prepare, and then you have to be silent, and then you have to pass to the action. You have to do something to convince the people that you can do it, and once you can do it, then they associate that voice. Because let's say it was a man's voice before, so they don't associate that a woman's actions with that type of speech pattern or voice or whatever, and then you just say it to prepare, and then it goes in their minds or collective minds or whatever, and then you go out, you do your thing, and then it's being there. So, but it serves no purpose to repeat and repeat and repeat until you've accomplished something, and then it's with the accomplishment that they'll associate. And I've been looking at a lot of reading a lot about cognitive behavior and everything, and now I'm starting to with all the stereotypes and all that, and just saying the heuristics also, how the brain operates and all that. So
I think the literature on coming out of psychology and communication, there are some people in communication beginning to talk about communicating through silence, not just voice as communication, or the written word. So, no, I'm just trying to put this into a particular context, and arguing that we need to bring silence as well as voice into our understanding of gendered and insecure sites, and those are the sites that I've spent a lot of time writing and thinking about. And we also have to think globally, because the different cultural patterns and different mean that what you can or cannot say or cannot say, choose to not say, differ in different situations. And so we have to understand that this is not something where you just have a model. It has to be framed within a context. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. I know Jane is always writing, so hopefully next year she'll come back and present her next project. Thank you very much for this.
Thanks. Thank you so much for being such an attentive and responsive audience. This is just what I needed because I'm going to present it again in a few weeks. So, a good run. You were looking very interested. So.
I'm Kevin, by the way.
Hi.
I'm the co-coordinator with Treasury.
Oh,
It's
wonderful.
lovely to meet you. I'll be going out with
Oh,
you for dinner.
wonderful.
Yeah, so, yeah, sorry, that's the best part.
Yes, yes.
So
But-
very much looking forward to it. That's a lovely talk. Some of the things that I want to say.
Oh, okay, well,
Maybe
we can
we'll
talk
discuss
about
it
it.
over
Yes.
dinner tonight.
Yes, yes. It's good.
Great presentation, Jane. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you. So you're off for now?
Yes, I'm just off for a week and I get back on around most of February, so let's
Very
go
good,
out.
very good. She's going to Australia. We'll have to go
For
up there.
all of February, so March. Okay.
February, we'll pick
I'll call you. Okay, enjoy Australia, that'll be great. Actually, you know, Marsha Burdett is going to Australia at the same time, in March. That's wonderful.
If I could ask you a couple of questions. Do you mind if I record? Just so I'm just wondering, you talk about silence and voice in insecure spaces, and some people might argue that
Can be a lot.
and what would you say about that in terms of students, their voice and silence?
Well, I think if you're in an insecure space, you have to choose whether it's better to speak or not speak. And basically you have to make those decisions on reading what's going on around you. But sometimes silence is a good strategy. Sometimes it's better to shout it out. So, but I do think that if a woman is, particularly a woman or a man, are experiencing harassment, they need to move out of it, not overreact, but move into themselves. Think about what do I think is happening, how should I handle it, maybe even talk to some people to get an idea before they go out and start talking. So silence is a great mechanism for helping you figure out what kind of problem you're facing and how you should strategize.
Yeah, good to meet you.
It was mentioned that you really good.
I'll be around, I'm away for a week in England and I'll come in and
I keep thinking about our paper and
yeah, let's do that.
I've been, I think I need
And then it was mentioned that you Professor Alley.
No.
Oh, you're still there.
No.
That started in 2011.
And what kind of,
I've been on a lot of PhD committees,
I had one problem with
mainly in the area of gender and
I had read had this argument that evolution is like
so I enjoy it. I'm also a Kelsen.
yeah, and when did you start writing this book?
Oh, I would say it's like 5 years of thinking, because you go back to the first article, Choosing Silence, then the gestation of thinking about it, and then eventually, but yeah, this one took a long time because we started talking about it 4 years ago. And we got the idea, and we managed to get it accepted by Routledge. Then, it was just a long
Another one,
process.
Baron Hess's
It was a
book that
process
I'm
that we
reading. Baron
needed.
Hess is a story of
We had to go through that.
really powerful.
Time
stuff.
was necessary.
Yeah, it's the best history.
Sometimes you
Oh,
can't
really?
see
Yeah.
things except before you see
Yeah,
them.
which one?
And was there like a
It's an
certain
insanely hyperactive.
interest that you wanted to actually write a book out of
I
this?
don't.
I think when I was talking with a friend from India, my co-editor, and we said, we should make a book. And I just thought, yes.
I mean, I really.
Interesting. And I imagine that perhaps they have different conceptions of silence and speech.
Yes, I think that different cultures, that's one of the lessons of the book. We have people from all around the world in it, writing about all kinds of different places. So that makes it international kind of assessment.
Is there anything you would like to add for students?
Well, I think students need to realize that we're in an age of heightened communication
about
And
values.
it's so easy to
Right?
constantly be talking,
And once you start
or
thinking
on
about
your
values,
cell
you
phone.
know,
It's also good to move away from that and sit and reflect. What do they really want?
Not that I
What do they
between
care?
philosophers.
What kind of studies matter to them? That kind of thing.
To do a gene.
Okay, you're welcome. Not to bother you one more time, but would I be able to get maybe a picture of you? Because we're going to probably
take one.
be putting
Is
it
it-
on.
Yeah, you just take one. Oh my goodness, there's a big, here, this is my coat. He organized
Oh.
it, so we can take one together.
Why don't
He
we-
organized
why
it,
don't
they
we-
both organized it. They can be the flower between.
This is for Parpart, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I might take a couple more, I'll just take a couple more.
Are you still working or academic and
Perfect.
Yes,
Thank
yes,
you
yes.
so much,
Yes,
wonderful,
yes.
and glad you enjoyed it.
Oh, this is great. I mean,
Yeah.
I'll talk to you more about
Okay.
over dinner. I had so many reactions, but of course, you know, withhold them
Because
others.
coming
I-
from
Yeah, no, I mean,
areas where you've dealt with
oh, yeah, I
the
think this,
dangerous places and things.
absolutely. This is my grandmother talking, I mean, you know,
Really?
about, she would say the same thing. She said, she'd say, I blame psychoanalysis.
So,
People
okay,
think
you can just leave it on and.
it's gonna be delivered right away,
Everything that
so.
I have, I just have to check that, where's mine?
And I return it to you?
Where did I put mine?
Uh,
Yeah, okay, I didn't
I
bring,
gave it to you at the beginning.
here it is, right here.
All right,
Great.
super. So say hi to Tim. I just got a message from him. He's doing
Oh.
well.
Communicating. Hi, did that speak to you?
Oh, yeah, very much. I just wish I had. I can never find my way around the well. I got here about 5 minutes or 1 minute to half an hour to find the building. Oh, first part.
Here, next time call us. But I'm delighted to have you look at the book sometime. This is, speaks really to you.
Well, I was thinking we do an area, but this is a across the street. Okay. Are you going back to this first?
Sure, come up to my office.
Where is it?
Well, it's 8th floor.
I'll see here and
Right, you
build
see
together.
here and go together.
She'll see because I think with Osman, he wants to be
Well, I mean,
I know, yeah.
I was feeling a little bit slow in the beginning, but it felt like it all started when someone asked me to write something about silence. And I just had this quarrel in my head with kind of the years, agency is, oh, this is doing.
It's those and really culture's all about speaking, right?
Yes, I guess so,
And
yeah. And I just started thinking about the number of times that all over the world, I've seen all of these. Very strategic.
And where?
Women really, and where is very important. Yes, where is very important. But I think that there's
Many years before I started at the festival.
I have a very weird book that my daughter gave me. I should read it. It was given to me for Christmas. Yeah. But I think that it's my grandmother. I remember I was going to rant and rave, and I was all set to go attend my grandfather, who was dean of Clark University.
all these things.
And leave it to me.
We do. So
She's so unliberated.
liberation.
think that we,
Basically,
you can't talk about
to have
mystics,
really, really want to understand
Buddhist traditions, the power connected to of silence, very
perfect.
Yeah, you're around, I'm off to England on Friday, and tomorrow, if you can come out to Westwood, I can see you, but I'm not going to come in town, so on Friday I have to go teach, Friday, Thursday. Yeah. I'm teaching a class called, but I'm only going to do 2 hours. But I'd love to see you on Thursday.
Yeah, well, I sent you.
Oh, you did, okay.
Are you able to make a one now?
I need to, I think that Tim wants to go home, but I could see about it. If you could go. Is it easier if we could meet now? Yeah. Okay, let me see, and then I'll.
How are you guys saying hello? Good job.
Yes, and I just put in, she had a nice put in it.
So you guys are
Are they from that?
Yes. So that's
Okay, then I'll see you in Montreal.
Yes.
6 o'clock.
6 o'clock. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Okay, thanks so much.
Okay, thank you. Sean, would it be possible for you to talk with Tim for half an hour while I had a cup of coffee with Elena?
Sure.
Okay, why
I
don't
might
I-
just
Okay, and then you can come
You
up.
have a mobile phone.
Yes, I do. Yeah, so it's not on me, but it's with